It is the 10th of February 1943, and a massive force of Soviet troops consisting of around 43,000 infantry and between 60 and 100 tanks, supported by a whopping 1,000 artillery pieces and air elements, are storming towards the Axis lines. A Soviet hammer that was about to smash into a force of only 4,900 Axis troops. How could they possibly resist such a force? Well, these were no ordinary troops. These were the men of the Spanish Blue Division, and the Soviets had miscalculated their fighting spirit. Firstly, we need to look just before the battle. The taking of Krasny Bor was part of the Soviet Operation Polar Star, an ambitious plan to punch through the Axis lines and cut off Army Group North, and then to destroy them absolutely. This operation, like many Soviet ones, were high risk, high reward. They relied on all elements of the attack to work for it to succeed, which is why they employed such crushing and overwhelming numbers to do so. Krasny Bor was situated around 20 miles from Leningrad, which was still under siege, and was a town on a major highway and rail supply link between Moscow and Leningrad. It was strategically valuable, and both sides knew it, and control of this position would give the Soviets a vital staging point for further operations. The days prior to the assault were the start of the Soviets' undoing. With the Axis forces learning of the upcoming attack, this was discovered by the notice of build-up of forces, and also when Soviet deserters were captured and found to have fresh underwear, meaning that they were fresh troops and that new forces were being hurried to the front lines for a major operation. Quite a weird way to discover that your enemy is about to attack, but nevertheless effective. The initial Soviet plan was for the first attack force, consisting of around 33,000 men and 30 tanks, to take Krasny Bor and push the defending forces back, and a second wave consisting of the 122nd Tank Brigade and the 35th Ski Brigade, with around 10,000 men and supporting armour elements, to advance through the gap in the line towards a town called Tosno and exploit the breakthrough before the Axis forces could regroup and respond to the breach. To make matters worse for the defending Spaniards, their forces consisted of relatively light units, which were as follows: the 250th Reserve Battalion, the 262nd Regiment, 3 battalions, the 250th Reconnaissance Group, the Ski Company, the 1st Artillery Group, 3 batteries with 10.5cm guns, the 1st Battery of the 3rd Artillery Group with 10.5cm guns, the 1st Battery of the 4th Artillery Group with 15cm guns, anti-tank gun group with 3.7cm guns, very light anti-tank guns I must say, and the Assault Sapper Group. As you can see, very few artillery and anti-tank guns, and no armour at all, and the AT guns they possessed were far too light to penetrate the Soviet tanks. Their one saving grace was they had ample small arms and explosives, and were well trained in what weapons they had, but the Soviets were deploying a very well equipped force. It comprised of the 43rd Guards Infantry Division, the 45th Infantry Division, the 63rd Guards Infantry Division, the 72nd Infantry Division, may have been a former Ukrainian penal unit, we know, the 14th Infantry Regiment, the 133rd Infantry Regiment, the 141st Infantry Regiment, 9th Artillery Regiment, 31st Artillery Regiment, 46th Artillery Regiment, 187 artillery batteries of 124mm and 203mm guns. They were specially heavy, they were basically siege guns. 2 battalions of 80mm mortars and 2 battalions of 76.2mm anti-tank guns, which also could be used as field guns to bombard the enemy. The 35th Motorised Brigade, the 34th Ski Brigade, and the 250th Ski Brigade. This force had an insane amount of artillery, over 1,000 artillery pieces, and its armoured forces were between 60 and 100 tanks, all of which were of the T-34 and KV series of tanks. All these tanks had strong armour and good firepower, and with a lack of anti-tank weapons and armoured support, the Spaniards were at a major disadvantage, never mind being outnumbered around 9-1 at the start of the battle, with many of the Soviet infantry being from the famed Guard regiments, the cream of the crop of the Red Army. These really were elite troops that were battle-hardened and had the pick of the best recruits and always got the best equipment first, so a real threat to the Spanish Blur Division. So on the 10th of February at 6:40am, the Soviet artillery opened up. A combination over 1,000 artillery pieces and mortars smashed the Spanish Blur Division's lines. This bombardment that lasted 2 hours was so heavy it smashed brick buildings to pieces and shattered trenches, and broke even the most fortified positions. The troops of the Blur Division were helpless against it and had to sit tight and hope that an artillery shell would not land upon where they lay. And after battering the front of the Axis forces, the barrage moved to the rear lines. to destroy but also pin the forces in place, as to pull back through it would be certain death. As this happens, constant air attacks from the Soviet Air Force harassed and killed troops with bombs and strafing runs, and to stop easy movement from the back forces who tried to regroup and reorganize their broken lines. Even with this colossal barrage, and the Spaniards taking around 50% of their day's casualties from the Soviet artillery alone, the Blau Division held firm, and as the Soviet troops pressed in, they met their enemy head-on. The Soviets advanced with combined arms tactics, with their infantry trying to support the T-34 tanks and KVs as they pushed in. The first engagements were at around 8:50 am east at the October Railway, where the Blau Division troops were dug into the embankment of the October Railway line. They repulsed 2 Soviet attacks, but took around 160 casualties, around 3/4 of their total strength in that area, at which point the 3rd Soviet push surrounded and destroyed the last of these brave men. But it cost the Soviets valuable tanks and troops, and as the Blau Division were employing fanatical and near-suicidal tactics, they would fight to the death, living up to their amazing reputation. In the centre of the defence line, the Soviets advanced with good pace, only being stopped by the 5th and 6th Companies of the 262nd Regiment, which were in a battered state, but they had no choice but to resist the Soviet onslaught, as they had advanced within firing distance of the nearby hospital, which was filled with hundreds and soon to be thousands of their wounded brothers at arms. And as 1 p.m. rolled around, the men of the Blau Division went into what I would call a berserker fury, employing anti-tank bundle grenades, Molotov cocktails, and magnetic mines, and stormed into the Soviet attack lines, gunning down infantry and charging tanks to destroy them. This cost many a Spanish life, but with every tank they destroyed, they were able to cut down the Soviets' ability to advance. Without these armoured vehicles, their troops were taking heavy casualties and being pushed back, and these attacks were then stopped dead. The Soviet troops knew they could not advance without the armour, but there was no way they could stop the fanatical assault from the Spaniards. To the far western area of Krasny Bor, all hell broke loose on the Blau Division, where men of the 250th Reserve Battalion were set upon by Soviet forces. With the combined ferocity of the Soviet infantry and tanks and the weight of the artillery barrage had absolutely shattered these men. And once the ground troops closed in, they could only put up a weak yet strong-willed resistance, and by mid-afternoon only 13 men remained of the original force there, and had no choice but to surrender to the Soviet forces, as they were out of men and they were out of ammo. Even though the Soviets had penetrated deep into the town of Krasny Bor, they had taken substantial losses, but the majority of tanks they deployed had been lost, and this led the Blau Division being able to launch brutal counter-strikes and cause massive infantry losses, but not without themselves taking their own heavy casualties. It literally came down to a fanatical level of morale, which meant the Spaniards would spend their lives if it meant causing casualties to the Soviet forces. As the battle raged on the ground, the skies were also alight with conflict, as Soviet close air support and fighters hit the Blau Division lines, attempting to break them. While this happened, though, the German bombers struck back, hitting Soviet forces in the rear lines at the town of Kolpino, to the north of Krasny Bor. This caused some damage, but did not stop the Soviet assault. As the sun set and rose on the 11th, the Soviets attempted to break the Blau Division's lines with a second push, but they had not learnt lessons from the first day, that the Spaniards would rather die than fall back, and once again they were beaten back with the Spanish targeting the Soviet tanks and isolating and killing their infantry units. Even with catastrophic casualties, the Blau Division would not retreat. This is truly why the Soviet assault failed, as under normal circumstances, a force would have fallen back and traded the land for saving lives. But the Spaniards went against the grain to the Soviets' peril, and by the end of the Battle of Krasny Bor, casualties were high on both sides. The Spanish Blau Division having lost 3,645 men, with 300 missing, from the original 4,900 men deployed during the battle. Over 26 hours they had fought non-stop and lost 75% of their men, or 188 men per hour. But they had bled the Soviets dearly, inflicting around 13,000 Soviet casualties and knocking out all of their tanks, either destroying them or making them so badly damaged they're of no further use. All of this for very small gains on the Soviet side, and their assault has been a massive failure. But even though this battle is classed as a victory for the Axis forces, it came at a very high price, and it was the end of the Spanish Blau Division as an effective fighting force. This didn't stop them fighting further in World War II, as even when called back to Spain, many carried on the fight as the Spanish Legion and moved into German infantry and SS divisions were they more than happy to have these elite, heavily armed troops. The aftermath of the battle also gave Soviet officers food for thought on how they had possibly failed with such overwhelming superiority in numbers, firepower, armour, and air support. Firstly, the employment of armour in a combined arms assault was used, but many times the supporting infantry failed to keep up or stay in close proximity to the tanks, allowing even lightly armed troops with limited anti-tank weapons the ability to destroy them. Secondly, the Soviet command was not well organised. The fact of this type of operation, it was based on all attacking elements succeeding. It was a high risk, high reward strategy that could engulf and annihilate Axis forces when successful, but when it failed would cause a disjointed attack, which even if one penetrated deep into enemy lines, would mean they could easily be cut off and killed. And thirdly, the Soviets massively underestimated the Spanish Blur Division's fanatical morale and their tenacity to fight, which allowed them not only to beat superior numbers, but also troops of the elite Guards forces, and ultimately left them with high casualties and a strategic failure. But Soviet high command learned few lessons from Krasny Bor. As the war went on and the Axis forces were beaten back on all fronts in terms of numbers and equipment, even with bad losses, there was no way to stop either side of the Allied juggernaut. I hope you enjoyed this video on the Battle of Krasny Bor and the Spanish Blur Division's tenacious defence. I also have a previous older video, with not as good microphone I would say, about the Spanish Blur Division that I will link as well if you're interested in learning a bit about this amazing regiment. I knew very little about them previously, but they've become my favourite of World War II. And thanks again for watching. Obviously like, subscribe and leave a comment if you enjoyed it. And you guys have a wonderful day.